The knock came at exactly 10:17 a.m. Margaret Hill glanced at the clock above her kitchen sink, the second hand ticking louder than usual in the quiet house. It was always around this time, never early, never late. Precise. Reliable. Comforting. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and smiled to herself. "He's right on time again," she murmured, already knowing who it was. Outside, the sun warmed the sidewalks of her quiet Houston neighborhood, cicadas humming faintly in the trees. Margaret moved slowly toward the front door, her knees stiff at 74, her heart steady with routine. She did not look through the peephole. She never did. The door opened to a familiar sight, the blue postal uniform, neatly pressed, the leather satchel slung across a broad shoulder, the same easy smile that had greeted her for nearly 3 years. "Morning, Miss Hill," the postman said warmly. "Hope I didn't catch you in the middle of something." "Not at all," Margaret replied. "You're right on time, as always." He chuckled softly, the sound practiced, reassuring. "I try. Got a couple of letters for you today, and a package that looks heavier than it ought to be." Margaret frowned slightly. "Oh dear. I wasn't expecting anything." "No trouble," he said quickly. "I can bring it in for you, if you like. Wouldn't want you straining yourself." There it was. The offer that had once felt thoughtful, then generous, then normal. Margaret hesitated, just for a moment. Something flickered in her mind, an unease she couldn't name, like forgetting why you'd entered a room. She brushed it away. He'd helped her before. Everyone knew him. Everyone trusted him. "That would be kind," she said, stepping aside. The postman crossed the threshold, boots quiet on the tile. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. He set the package on the dining table, then lingered, glancing around as if orienting himself. "You holding up all right?" he asked. "Haven't seen your daughter stop by this week." Margaret stiffened slightly. "She's busy with work. Calls every night." "Of course," he said, nodding. "You're lucky to have family who cares." He said it gently, but something in his eyes lingered too long, as if he were cataloging her words, filing them away. Margaret noticed the silence stretch. The ticking clock grew louder again. "Well," she said, forcing a light tone, "thank you for the help." The postman smiled, wider this time. "Any time. That's what neighbors are for." He turned toward the door, then paused. "By the way," he added casually, "have you noticed any mail missing lately? We've had a few complaints down the street." Margaret shook her head. "No, everything's been fine." "Good. Good," he said. "Just thought I'd check." He stepped outside, tipping an imaginary hat before walking down the path to the next house. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling. She couldn't explain why her hands were trembling. 2 blocks away, Evelyn Parker stood on her porch watching the same blue-uniformed figure approach. At 68, Evelyn prided herself on her sharp instincts. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years and trusted patterns more than people. And something about this man, this beloved postman, had begun to trouble her. He waved when he saw her. "Afternoon, Ms. Parker." "It's still morning," she replied flatly. He laughed, unfazed. "Feels like afternoon already." She watched his eyes flick briefly toward her front window, then the side yard, then back to her face. Assessing. Measuring. "You look tired," he said. "Everything all right?" "I'm fine," Evelyn answered. "You're early today." "Am I?" He checked his watch. "Guess I'm ahead of schedule." "That's unusual for you." He smiled again. "Too quickly. Even I make mistakes." Evelyn accepted her mail without inviting him inside. When he walked away, she noticed him slow near her driveway, glancing back once, just once, before moving on. She felt a chill despite the heat. By noon, the postman had completed half his route. Elderly women waved from windows. Some brought him bottled water. One pressed a cookie into his hand. To them, he was dependable. Familiar. Safe. No one noticed how he memorized door locks. How he tracked who lived alone. How he listened more than he spoke. No one noticed the small notebook tucked behind his mailbag, its pages filled with careful handwriting, names, routines, notes marked with times and symbols only he understood. And no one could have imagined that this ordinary morning, with its friendly smiles and polite offers of help, would be remembered not for what happened, but for what it quietly began. Because before the sun set that day, one act of trust would cross a line it could never return from. And the knock everyone trusted would become the sound no one could forget. By the following Monday, the story of the postman had already made its way through half the neighborhood, though not as a warning, and certainly not as suspicion. It moved the way praise often does, warmly, casually, passed between porches and grocery store aisles like a shared comfort. He carried my groceries all the way to the kitchen, Mrs. Alvarez told anyone who would listen, her voice glowing with gratitude. Wouldn't even let me tip him. He checks on my mother when I'm working late, another woman said. Calls me if something feels off. We're lucky to have him. Lucky. That was the word most often used. His name was Marcus Reed, and in this part of Houston, that name meant consistency. 36 years old, married once, briefly, no children, no scandals, no visible flaws. He lived alone in a modest rental on the edge of the city, drove an unremarkable sedan, and kept his lawn trimmed with almost obsessive neatness. The kind of man people described as solid. At the post office, supervisors trusted him implicitly. He never called in sick. Never arrived late. His uniform was always clean, his paperwork flawless. When new carriers struggled with routes, Marcus volunteered to help. When an elderly resident complained about missing mail, he followed up personally. He made it easy to believe in him. That belief didn't happen all at once. It was built carefully, brick by brick, favor by favor. Marcus learned early on that people rarely questioned help that arrived wrapped in politeness. He held doors. Remembered birthdays. Asked after grandchildren by name. He kept his voice calm, his posture open, his expressions warm but never intense. Nothing about him felt urgent or demanding. Especially not to elderly women. They saw in him what they wanted to see, a dependable young man, respectful, patient, almost protective. He reminded some of a son who had moved away, others of a husband long gone. Marcus never encouraged the comparison outright, but he never corrected it either. When Mrs. Hill struggled to lift a package, he was already reaching for it. When Mrs. Alvarez complained about her porch light being out, he mentioned, casually, that he knew how to fix it. When Evelyn Parker declined his help, he smiled just the same, marking her house mentally with a quiet note of caution. Trust, Marcus knew, wasn't demanded. It was accumulated. On his route, he lingered longer than necessary at certain houses, always with a reason. A form to explain. A delivery to confirm. A neighbor's package mistakenly routed to the wrong address. Each visit gave him more information. Who lived alone? Who had family nearby? Who locked their doors? Who didn't? He listened more than he spoke, letting women fill the silence with details they didn't realize were valuable. Doctor appointments. Travel plans. Financial worries. Fears about falling. Loneliness disguised as small talk. Loneliness was the easiest door to open. At night, Marcus returned home and wrote everything down. Not obsessively, methodically. He told himself it was just organization, the same discipline that made him good at his job. But the notebook grew thicker with each passing week. By the time anyone noticed, it would already be too late. From the outside, Marcus's life appeared quiet, almost dull. He grocery shopped at the same store every Thursday. Ate dinner alone. Watched the local news. Occasionally attended a neighborhood barbecue if invited. At one such gathering, a woman joked loudly, "We should clone you, Marcus. The city would be a better place." He laughed along with everyone else. But even as he smiled, something inside him hardened. He didn't see himself as kind. He saw himself as careful. Kindness implied selflessness. What Marcus practiced was control. He liked knowing who depended on him. Liked being missed if he altered his routine. Liked how his presence shifted the energy in a room, how people relaxed when he arrived. It made him feel powerful without appearing dangerous. And that was the key. Danger announced itself. Power like his stayed invisible. Not everyone, however, was completely charmed. Evelyn Parker had begun keeping her own notes, though she didn't think of them that way. She noticed patterns. Changes. Margaret Hill, once sharp and talkative, had grown quieter. Mrs. Alvarez stopped attending church as often. Another woman down the block suddenly installed new locks without explanation. When Evelyn asked gentle questions, she received vague answers. "Oh, Marcus is just helping me sort things out," Margaret had said with a nervous smile. Helping with what? Evelyn wanted to ask. But she didn't. Not yet. Because suspicion, like trust, needed proof. The post office received its first formal complaint that month, a missing check, last seen in an outgoing envelope. Marcus handled it personally, assuring the resident it would be investigated. The check was later found, misplaced, supposedly. No report filed. No escalation. Another complaint followed. Then another. Each time, Marcus was there to smooth things over. Each time, his reputation protected him. And so the community continued to praise the man who brought their mail, never realizing that behind the polite nods and neighborly concern, something far darker was taking shape. The perfect public servant was doing exactly what he had always done best. Blending in. Waiting. And inch by inch, pushing past boundaries no one realized had already been crossed. The favors began so small that no one could pinpoint when gratitude turned into dependence. For Margaret Hill, it started with paperwork. A letter from her insurance company arrived one afternoon, dense with legal language in fine print. Marcus noticed it sticking out of her mailbox and mentioned, casually, that his ex-wife used to work in claims. "If you want," he said, "I can take a look and explain it. These things are written to confuse people." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. That would be helpful. He sat at her dining table, glasses perched low on his nose, reading carefully. His voice was calm, confident. When he finished, he summarized the letter in simple terms and pointed out what needed to be signed. Nothing urgent, he assured her. But don't let it sit too long. From that day on, Margaret brought him her mail before opening it. It felt efficient. Sensible. She trusted him. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez accepted help of a different kind. Her knees ached badly on cold mornings, and Marcus offered to take her trash bins to the curb. "Just until your son visits again," he said. Weeks passed. Her son didn't come. Marcus kept taking the bins. Then one day, he mentioned her porch steps looked loose. He fixed them that afternoon. "You shouldn't risk a fall," he said gently. The words stayed with her. Soon, she stopped doing things herself, not because she couldn't, but because Marcus was there. Watching. Ready. Invisible lines shifted. Marcus was careful never to rush. He knew pressure raised alarms. Instead, he framed everything as concern. As kindness. As prevention. He learned which women were embarrassed to ask for help and which ones were grateful for it. He adjusted accordingly. Some needed reassurance. Others needed praise. "You're doing great, you know," he told Margaret once. "Most people your age struggle more." She glowed at the compliment. Control didn't always look like dominance. Often, it looked like affirmation. He also learned their weaknesses. Margaret forgot dates. Mrs. Alvarez hated paperwork. Another woman, June Collins, feared banks and kept cash hidden in her home. Marcus never commented directly. He filed the information away. Then came the requests. "Could you sign this for me?" Margaret asked one morning, holding out a form she hadn't read fully. Of course, Marcus said, barely glancing at it before guiding her hand. Just routine. When Mrs. Alvarez mentioned a missing bill, Marcus offered to check her statements. Sometimes things get lost in the system, he said. He began accompanying some of them inside their homes more often, always invited, always welcome. He learned where spare keys were kept. Which doors creaked. Which windows never locked. No one thought twice about it. He had earned their trust. Or so they believed. Evelyn Parker noticed the changes more clearly than anyone else. Margaret no longer spoke freely. Her answers were shorter, rehearsed. When Evelyn asked if she needed anything, Margaret smiled nervously and said, "Marcus has it covered." That sentence unsettled her. One afternoon, Evelyn saw Marcus leaving June Collins's house later than usual. He was carrying a folder under his arm. "Everything okay with June?" Evelyn asked from her porch. "Just helping her sort some documents," Marcus replied smoothly. "She gets overwhelmed." "Does she?" Evelyn said. "She's always been quite organized." Marcus smiled, but his eyes cooled. Age changes people. He walked away before Evelyn could respond. That night, Evelyn wrote the date down on a scrap of paper and circled it. Inside his notebook, Marcus began categorizing. Green marks for easy compliance. Yellow for hesitation. Red for resistance. Evelyn Parker had earned a red. But she was younger than the others. Stronger. Less isolated. Not worth the risk, yet. He focused instead on those who trusted him completely. The boundary he crossed next wasn't physical. It was financial. A small loan here. A temporary favor there. "Just until your pension clears," he told Mrs. Alvarez. "I'll pay you back," she insisted. "I know you will," he said, smiling. No rush. But there was always a rush. Late fees. Confusion. Panic. And Marcus was always there with a solution, one that tied them closer to him. He never took large amounts at first. That would draw attention. He took what could be explained away. Misplaced. Forgotten. Miscounted. Gas money. Grocery cash. Checks that needed help depositing. Each time, he framed it as assistance. Each time, they thanked him. By the time Margaret realized she no longer understood her own finances, she was too embarrassed to ask for help from anyone else. Marcus had become the gatekeeper to her sense of stability. When he started asking questions about her will, she laughed nervously. "You're not planning on getting rid of me, are you?" she joked. He smiled. "Just making sure you're protected." Protection. That word worked every time. On a humid Thursday afternoon, Marcus stood at the end of his route and looked back down the street. Elderly women waved from windows. Doors stood unlocked. He felt a familiar satisfaction settle in his chest. The lines were gone now. They didn't know it yet, but he did. And once invisible lines were crossed, they could never be redrawn. Only pushed further. Only taken advantage of. And Marcus Reed was already deciding how far he was willing to go. The first real crack in Marcus Reed's perfect image did not come from a victim. It came from a mistake. On a Tuesday afternoon thick with Houston heat, a padded envelope landed in Evelyn Parker's mailbox bearing the wrong name. Not a neighbor's, someone who didn't live on the street at all. The return address was handwritten, shaky, unmistakably elderly. Inside was a bank statement. Evelyn froze. She did not open it fully. She didn't need to. The partial account number, the balance visible through the fold, it was enough to tell her this was not junk mail, not an accident to be shrugged off. It was personal. Sensitive. Dangerous. Evelyn waited. When Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, his usual smile in place, she stepped onto her porch before he could pass. "You misdelivered something," she said, holding up the envelope. For the first time since she had known him, Marcus hesitated. It was subtle. A fraction of a second. But Evelyn caught it. "Oh," he said lightly, reaching for it. "Let me take care of that." She did not hand it over. "This belongs to someone on another route," she said. "Not even close to here." Marcus laughed softly. "Must have been mixed in by mistake. Happens sometimes." "Does it?" Evelyn asked. "Because I've lived here 30 years, and I've never received anyone else's bank statement." The air between them shifted. Marcus's smile tightened. "I'll make sure it's delivered properly." Evelyn watched his hand as she finally passed him the envelope. His fingers closed around it too quickly, too firmly, as if afraid she might change her mind. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She thought about Margaret Hill's sudden quietness. About June Collins's folder. About Mrs. Alvarez's frequent trips to the ATM, something she had never done alone before. One mistake meant nothing. But patterns meant everything. The second whisper came from someone Marcus had not considered at all. Luis Moreno, a retired postal carrier, had taken to walking the neighborhood every morning. He recognized routes the way musicians recognized melodies. When something felt off, he noticed. He noticed how Marcus lingered. Not chatting, observing. He noticed how often Marcus rechecked certain mailboxes, how he adjusted letters inside instead of simply dropping them. One morning, Luis stopped him. "You got a long route," Luis said casually. Marcus nodded. "Keeps me busy." "Funny thing," Luis continued. "I used to cover this area. Didn't take that long unless something slowed you down." Marcus shrugged. "I like to make sure people are okay." Luis smiled politely. "That's not the job." Marcus's eyes flicked toward him, sharp, assessing. "No," Marcus said. "But it's part of being decent." Luis let him pass, but the unease lingered. Later that week, Luis overheard two women at the pharmacy comparing notes. "He helps me with my mail," one said. "He does mine too," the other replied. "He says it's safer that way." Safer. Luis frowned. Mail carriers were trained never to open or handle personal documents beyond delivery. Help, yes, but boundaries were strict. He went home and dug out his old employee handbook. The rules hadn't changed. Meanwhile, Margaret Hill sat at her dining table staring at a stack of papers she no longer recognized. Bank statements. Insurance forms. Documents with her name typed neatly at the top, but decisions she didn't remember making. Her chest tightened. She reached for the phone. Then she stopped. Marcus had told her not to worry. He had said these things were complicated on purpose, that people took advantage of confusion. "I'm just protecting you," he'd said. The thought of calling her daughter filled her with shame. How could she explain that she didn't understand her own life anymore? So she stayed silent. And silence did the rest. The complaints resumed at the post office, quietly at first. Checks delayed. Statements missing. One woman claimed she never received a tax document that had been marked delivered. Marcus volunteered to investigate each case. Every time, the issue resolved itself. Paperwork found. Mail misrouted. Confusion blamed on age. His supervisors praised his initiative. And yet, something began to shift. An internal audit was scheduled, not because of Marcus, but because of volume discrepancies across several routes. Marcus wasn't worried. He should have been. Evelyn Parker finally acted on a Friday evening. She knocked on Margaret Hill's door with a pie she didn't expect to share. Margaret opened the door slowly, her smile thin. "I just wanted to check on you," Evelyn said. "You've seemed distant." Margaret glanced over her shoulder before answering. "I'm fine. Are you?" Evelyn asked gently. "Or is someone helping you a little too much?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears instantly. That was all the confirmation Evelyn needed. She lowered her voice. "You're not alone," she said. And whatever it is, it can be fixed. Margaret shook her head. You don't understand. He said. Who? Evelyn pressed. Margaret whispered the name. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Because now it wasn't a suspicion. It was a warning. And warnings, once spoken, could no longer be ignored. Somewhere across the city, Marcus Reed closed his notebook and smiled to himself, unaware that for the first time since he'd begun, someone was no longer quietly watching. They were preparing to stop him. The night it happened, Houston was wrapped in heavy rain. Not the kind that startled people indoors, but the steady, relentless downpour that blurred streetlights and softened sound. The neighborhood slept through it, windows glowing faintly behind drawn curtains, trusting the familiarity of routine. Margaret Hill did not sleep. She sat in her living room with a lamp on, paperwork spread across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle she could no longer assemble. Evelyn's words echoed in her head, "You're not alone," but fear had already taken root. At 9:42 p.m., her phone buzzed. Marcus. Her heart jumped. She let it ring once before answering. Hello? Miss Hill, his voice came smoothly through the line, calm as ever. I didn't mean to bother you so late. I realized I forgot to return some documents today. Oh, Margaret said, swallowing. That's all right. It can wait. There was a pause. Just long enough to feel wrong. I'm actually nearby, Marcus said gently. I know you've been anxious about all this. I thought it might ease your mind to go over everything together. Just 10 minutes. Margaret hesitated. Rain tapped against the windows. The house felt too quiet. I don't know. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, he said. You trust me, don't you? The question wasn't new. But tonight, it felt heavier. Yes, she said finally. Good, Marcus replied. I'll be right there. The call ended. Margaret stood, hands trembling. She thought about calling Evelyn. About locking the door. About all the moments she had brushed aside her discomfort. Instead, she tidied the papers. The knock came exactly 12 minutes later. Across the street, Evelyn Parker sat at her desk rereading notes she had scribbled over the past week. Dates. Names. Oddities she couldn't explain away anymore. Then she saw Marcus's car pull up. Her stomach tightened. She watched from behind her curtain as he stepped out, rain slicking his jacket, folder tucked under his arm. He walked up Margaret's path with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Evelyn grabbed her phone. Before she could dial, the porch light went out. Inside Margaret's house, the air felt thick. Marcus set the folder down and removed his jacket slowly, methodically, as if time didn't matter. You should have called your daughter, Margaret said suddenly, surprising herself. Marcus looked up. Why would I do that? I mean, I should have, she corrected, flustered. Marcus smiled. There's no need to involve anyone else. That just complicates things. He opened the folder. Margaret leaned forward, and froze. These aren't my documents, she said. Some of these accounts. I never approved this. Marcus sighed, closing the folder carefully. I was hoping we wouldn't have this conversation tonight. Her pulse raced. What conversation? The one where you get confused, he said softly. And scared. Margaret stood. You need to leave. Marcus didn't move. I've been protecting you, he continued. From mistakes. From people who would take advantage. You're the one taking advantage, she whispered. His expression changed, not dramatically, not violently. It hardened, like something finally settling into place. You were fine with my help, he said. Until someone filled your head with ideas. Evelyn. Margaret took a step back. Marcus stepped forward. The next moments blurred, voices raised, a chair knocked over, panic crashing through the room. Margaret reached for the phone. Marcus grabbed her wrist. Stop, he said sharply. "You're making this worse," she screamed. The sound cut through the rain, short and sharp, before something heavy struck the table. Evelyn heard it. She was already on her feet, dialing emergency services as she ran toward the door. By the time she reached Margaret's porch, the house was dark. She pounded on the door. "Margaret!" No answer. The door was unlocked. Inside, the living room was in chaos. Papers scattered. Furniture overturned. The lamp shattered on the floor. Margaret lay still. Evelyn screamed. Police lights flooded the street minutes later, red and blue reflecting off wet pavement. Neighbors emerged in robes and slippers, whispers rising in shocked disbelief. An ambulance arrived. Margaret Hill was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was blunt force trauma. There were no signs of forced entry. And no sign of Marcus Reed. The news hit the community like a bomb. By morning, yellow tape cordoned off the house that had once smelled of lemon cleaner and old books. Reporters gathered. Neighbors cried. The women who had trusted Marcus stared at their televisions in disbelief. "He was always so kind," one said. "He helped my mother," another whispered. At the post office, supervisors stood stunned as detectives asked questions Marcus had never expected to answer. When they went to his rental home, it was empty. Clothes gone. Notebook missing. His car was found abandoned near a highway access road, rain washing away footprints. But not everything. In the glove compartment, officers found a single envelope. Inside was a bank statement, with Margaret Hill's name on it. The case shifted instantly. A trusted postman became a suspect in a homicide. And the crime no one saw coming became the one no one could escape from. Because what had begun as quiet favors had ended in blood. And the truth, long ignored, was finally demanding to be seen. By sunrise, Marcus Reed's face was everywhere. Television screens in diners. News alerts on phones. Printed flyers taped to storefront windows. The same smiling image that once reassured the neighborhood now hovered over the words "person of interest" in bold, unforgiving letters. Detectives moved quickly. They had to. A beloved elderly woman was dead, a trusted public servant missing, and a community on the brink of panic. The first surprise came within hours. Marcus Reed was not who he claimed to be. At headquarters, detectives pulled his employment file and discovered discrepancies that should have raised alarms years earlier. His background check was clean, but too clean. No long-term addresses. Gaps in employment history explained away by temporary contracts. A previous postal job in another state had ended quietly, with no formal complaint but no recommendation either. When investigators contacted that post office, the response was cautious. He was reliable, the supervisor said. But there were concerns. Concerns that had never been documented. Because no one had ever proven anything. Detective Carla Mendoza, assigned to the case, focused on the financial angle. She believed people rarely committed crimes like this without motive, and Marcus's motive was beginning to surface clearly. Subpoenas revealed a web of small transactions linked to elderly women on his route. Nothing dramatic on its own. A few $100s here. A check cashed there. Account changes authorized during periods of assistance. But when stacked together, the pattern was undeniable. Marcus had been siphoning money for months. Not recklessly. Strategically. He targeted women with memory lapses, limited family oversight, and a strong sense of pride. Women unlikely to admit confusion. Unlikely to report loss. He built dependency first, Mendoza said grimly. Then control. The most disturbing discovery came from Margaret Hill's accounts. Days before her death, a beneficiary change had been submitted online, placing Marcus Reed as the sole recipient. The timestamp was precise. The authorization, legally valid. The signature? Digital. She was planning to cut him off, Mendoza concluded. He knew it. The search for Marcus expanded across Texas. His abandoned car suggested a planned escape, not panic. Inside, detectives found disposable gloves, a burner phone, and a city map with certain routes circled. But no notebook. That worried them most. Because the notebook wasn't sentimental. It was evidence. Meanwhile, Evelyn Parker became an unwilling focal point. Detectives interviewed her for hours. She handed over her notes without hesitation. Dates, observations, names. "You tried to warn someone," Mendoza said. "I didn't know who to trust," Evelyn replied. Everyone trusted him. Her voice broke when she described Margaret's fear. "I should have acted sooner," she whispered. Mendoza shook her head. He counted on silence. "That's not on you." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. Neither was the public. Online, opinions split violently. Some praised Evelyn as a hero. Others questioned why she hadn't called the police earlier. Trust had turned into suspicion of everyone. As investigators dug deeper, a scandal began to unfold. Internal reviews revealed that Marcus had been allowed far too much autonomy. Complaints dismissed. Audits delayed. Supervisors who feared paperwork more than risk. A local journalist uncovered that 3 other elderly women on Marcus's former route in another state had experienced unexplained financial losses. One had died under ambiguous circumstances, ruled accidental at the time. The story exploded. How many more? People demanded. Postal officials issued statements. Apologies followed. Policies were reviewed. Too late. The most chilling revelation came from a search warrant executed on a storage unit rented under an alias. Inside, officers found stacks of documents, bank statements, wills, insurance forms, all belonging to elderly women. Some were alive. Some were not. Each file was labeled. Organized. Cold. Marcus hadn't acted impulsively. He had practiced. But the twist, the one that shifted the entire case, came from a forensic analyst reviewing phone data. Marcus hadn't been acting alone. Text records showed repeated contact with a single number in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death. The messages were sparse but telling. "She's getting nervous. Handle it before she talks. Don't leave loose ends." The number was traced to a prepaid phone purchased by someone else. Someone local. Someone with access to the post office's internal systems. The investigation widened. Trust collapsed inward. As the manhunt continued, one truth became impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed was not just a predator hiding behind a uniform. He was a symptom. Of systems that failed. Of warnings ignored. Of kindness exploited. And somewhere out there, he was watching the chaos unfold, knowing that even if he was caught, the damage had already been done. Because secrets behind the uniform had finally been exposed. But the most dangerous secret of all was still walking free. The arrest did not come with sirens or chaos. There was no chase, no dramatic standoff, no last-minute escape attempt. Marcus Reed was found exactly where he wanted to be, alone, controlled, and watching the story unfold. 3 days after Margaret Hill's death, law enforcement traced Marcus to a roadside motel just outside Beaumont, Texas. The room smelled of stale air and disinfectant. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, shoes on, jacket folded neatly beside him, eyes fixed on the television where his own face filled the screen. When officers knocked, Marcus stood calmly and opened the door. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said, offering his wrists without being asked. At the station, Detective Carla Mendoza studied him closely. He looked tired, but not afraid. There was no panic in his movements, no anger in his voice, only a detached calm that unsettled everyone in the room. "Yes," Marcus said during the interrogation, hands folded on the table. "I was at Margaret Hill's house." He paused deliberately, then added, "But I did not kill her." Mendoza slid the evidence forward, financial records, photos from the storage unit, the beneficiary change that would have transferred Margaret's assets to him within days. Marcus barely glanced at them. "None of that proves murder," he said mildly. "Only opportunity." "She's dead," Mendoza replied sharply. Marcus nodded once. "An unfortunate consequence." The room fell silent. Marcus claimed Margaret had fallen. "She panicked," he said. "She was confused. She tried to grab her phone, lost her balance, and hit the table." The medical examiner's report contradicted him entirely. The injuries were deliberate, forceful, controlled. Marcus listened without interrupting. "People fall harder than you think," he said calmly when they finished. "Especially when they're scared." But when Mendoza mentioned the messages found on the burner phone, "Handle it before she talks," something changed. His jaw tightened. "You weren't texting yourself," Mendoza said. "So who was helping you?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Someone who understood how things disappear." That answer detonated the case. The prepaid phone led investigators to an unexpected source, Elaine Turner, a senior administrative coordinator at the Houston Postal Distribution Center. 49 years old. Married. 2 grown children. 15 years of unblemished service. Elaine wasn't on anyone's radar. She should have been. She had access to internal mail tracking systems, complaint logs, audit schedules. She could delay reports, reroute internal alerts, and suppress red flags before they reached supervisors. Elaine had been Marcus's shield. When police searched her home, they found internal documents, some printed, others handwritten, marked with dates, addresses, and notes like "resolved" and "no action needed." Instructions disguised as routine paperwork. She broke quickly. "He made me feel useful," Elaine sobbed during questioning. "Important. Like I was fixing things." Elaine admitted she knew Marcus was exploiting elderly women financially. She claimed she believed it was consensual help. But the messages told another story. When Margaret Hill began asking questions, when she grew nervous and started talking to neighbors, Elaine warned Marcus. "She's getting suspicious. If she reports you, we're both exposed. Handle it." Elaine insisted she never intended for anyone to be hurt. But intent no longer mattered. The fallout was immediate and vicious. The public didn't just feel betrayed, they felt hunted. A trusted postman. A trusted administrator. A system that ignored its own rules. News outlets swarmed the story. Internal postal reviews revealed years of overlooked complaints, dismissed concerns, and delayed audits. Supervisors who admitted they had relied too heavily on reputations instead of procedures. Elaine Turner was arrested and charged as an accessory before the fact. Marcus Reed was formally charged with murder. And the narrative shifted overnight. This was no longer a story about one man exploiting kindness. It was about how easily corruption hides behind routine. Evelyn Parker watched the press conference from her living room, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Hill's photograph appeared on screen, followed by Marcus's mugshot, and then Elaine's. "So that's how he knew," Evelyn whispered. "How complaints vanished. How warnings never reached the right ears. How Marcus always seemed one step ahead. It hadn't been luck. It had been protection." In custody, Marcus finally showed anger, not toward the charges, but toward Elaine. "She talked," he muttered when Mendoza informed him. "She told us everything," Mendoza replied. Marcus laughed hollowly. "Everyone talks eventually. That's why trust is a weakness." "You trusted her," Mendoza said. "No," Marcus replied coldly. "I used her." As the trial date approached, more victims came forward. Elderly women who had been afraid. Families who had noticed changes but lacked proof. Patterns emerged that made one thing clear. Margaret Hill was not an endpoint. She was an obstacle. And Marcus Reed had been willing to erase obstacles to protect what he believed he had earned. The twist shattered any remaining comfort the community had. The monster hadn't acted alone. And the most disturbing truth of all was this. Marcus Reed did not outsmart the system. The system worked exactly as it was designed. Quiet, efficient, and devastating to those who trusted it. The verdict was still months away. But the damage was already permanent. Because from that moment on, every knock carried doubt. And every uniform carried fear. The courtroom was quiet, though not peaceful. It was the kind of silence heavy with expectation, the kind that presses down on everyone, making breaths shallow and fidgeting unavoidable. Outside, a small crowd of neighbors and journalists gathered, clutching umbrellas against a rare January drizzle in Houston. Inside, families of the victims sat with expressions taut as strings, each silently calculating what justice might feel like. Marcus Reed sat at the defense table, composed, almost eerily calm. His hands were folded in front of him, his gaze steady on the prosecution as the judge began to read the verdict. Across the aisle, Elaine Turner's shoulders slumped. She had pleaded guilty to being an accessory before the fact, hoping for a lighter sentence. Her confession had blown the case wide open, but the weight of her complicity pressed on her like a storm cloud she could not shake. The room held its breath. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Hill, the judge intoned, "The jury finds the defendant." Every eye in the courtroom seemed to focus on Marcus. Some stared in anger, others in disbelief, many in a kind of stunned sorrow. The weight of years of misplaced trust pressed down on them all. Guilty. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Margaret's family cried softly, relief and sorrow entwined. Evelyn Parker, sitting quietly in the corner, felt a rush of vindication mixed with grief. She had known, she had seen the signs, yet nothing could bring Margaret back. Marcus's face remained nearly expressionless. Only his eyes flickered, tiny, almost imperceptible betrayals of the emotions he carefully masked for years. Outside the courtroom, neighbors whispered among themselves. The woman who had once handed him cookies for being so kind now stared at the police barricades in disbelief. How had the man they had welcomed into their homes, the man they had trusted with their lives, become a murderer? The tragedy wasn't only Margaret Hill. It was the erosion of trust that came after, the invisible cost of silence. Every elderly woman on the street, every family who had relied on Marcus's supposed goodness, now had to confront the reality that kindness had been a weapon. In the weeks that followed, Houston tried to make sense of what had happened. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, replaying Marcus's photographs, his interactions with neighbors, and his meticulous organization of the women's personal lives. Experts explained how predators exploit trust, psychologists analyzed his manipulative patterns, and journalists dug into Elaine Turner's complicity. The most haunting revelation, however, came from the community itself, how easily the warning signs had been ignored. The missing letters, the small financial discrepancies, the lingering presence in homes, all had been noted, yet no one had acted until it was too late. Evelyn Parker gave interviews cautiously. She spoke of her own guilt and responsibility. "I noticed things," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I questioned him, I saw Margaret's hesitation, but I didn't act fast enough. That's something I will carry forever." Her words resonated widely. Silence, the community realized, had been as dangerous as Marcus himself. Trust without vigilance had allowed manipulation to flourish unchecked. The trial also revealed shocking truths about the postal system's oversight. Internal reviews showed years of unchecked autonomy, dismissed complaints, and gaps in employee accountability. Marcus had exploited the system precisely because it was built to rely on reputation and protocol rather than continuous scrutiny. Elaine Turner's role had only amplified the issue. Without her access and knowledge, Marcus might have been slowed, but not stopped entirely. Houston's postal administration implemented sweeping changes, audits conducted more frequently, financial insecurity protocols revised, and mandatory reporting procedures enforced. But these changes felt reactive, an attempt to patch a system already exploited for years. For the residents of the neighborhood, life could never return to normal. Margaret's house remained vacant for months, her personal belongings carefully removed by her family. Yet the sense of violation lingered. Every time the mail arrived, every time a neighbor offered help, there was a shadow of suspicion. A doorbell ring that once signified routine now carried a small twinge of dread. Even friendships had been tested. Longtime neighbors debated who had done enough, or too little. Conversations that had once been friendly became tinged with quiet fear. Trust, once the invisible glue of the community, was fractured beyond repair. Evelyn Parker, once a quiet observer, became a local advocate for elderly protection and community vigilance. She organized neighborhood watches, held informational meetings about mail and financial safety, and helped neighbors recognize manipulative behavior before it escalated. She knew the lesson would be painful for everyone. Vigilance was a necessity, even in familiar faces. Marcus Reed, sentenced to life in prison without parole, maintained his calm composure throughout. Letters from the outside continued to arrive, though many went unanswered. Some messages expressed outrage, others curiosity. He had once wielded trust like a weapon. Now, the very thing he had manipulated had turned against him. Elaine Turner faced her own sentence, shorter but no less severe. She became a cautionary tale, the face of how blind complicity can aid destruction. And Margaret Hill? She became more than a name in the press. She became a symbol of what happens when ordinary people place absolute trust in someone who hides malevolence behind smiles. Her memory haunted the streets she had lived on, reminding everyone of the cost of being too kind, too trusting, or too silent. The final chapter of this story was not written in courtrooms or in newspapers. It was written quietly in the minds of the people who lived through it. Trust, once sacred, now carried a shadow. Guilt, once invisible, now lingered in every hesitant handshake, every wary glance, every locked door. And the cost of silence, the choice to ignore the subtle warnings, to believe in appearances over reality, would not be forgotten. Because in the end, Marcus Reed's crime was not only one of violence, it was a crime against the very essence of human connection. And the community of Houston, scarred but wiser, learned that even the most familiar knock at the door could hide darkness, waiting patiently behind a polite smile. The world had changed. The streets were the same. But no one would ever trust the ordinary quite the same way again.